Bueno, de el Global Forum on
We're
Cyber
back.
Expertise.
Global Forum on Cyber Expertise. That was before. Right now, I'm going to introduce Vice President of the National Agency of Communications, ENACOM. It's going to address about the access to information technology communications as a human right. As you know, this was addressed by new regulations in place, and Gustavo was so kind to be here. He's so kind to be here with us today, this morning. Thank you, Gustavo. When I watch TV at night, I was watching TV with my mother and I saw you in one of the programs, TV programs. Welcome. And I know that this is a very interesting topic. There are many people that lack access. And this is evident given the number of children that they discontinue or they do not have connectivity at home to follow their studies. It's a human right to be communicated nowadays and to be in contact with others. And this is clearly evidenced by the pandemic and the lockdown. We cannot go to our offices. I couldn't teach at the university. I'm teaching virtually right now. It's a learning. So it's timely that we have you here and for you to be so kind to share your experience with us. Good morning. Good morning, Olga. Good morning, the whole team that is organizing these conferences, the 12th edition of the Southern School of Internet Governance. For me, it's great to participate in these conferences and to discuss this with all of you. The pandemic brought something in Argentina that was not so clearly depicted or evidenced. The access to communication and information technologies, we say that it's a human right, a subject of it. There's a subject or a right to study, or the right to education, and this is done if we have the necessary conditions to have access to that minimum requirement that in our country it's free education. Why do I say this? Because the pandemic has demonstrated that having access to these technologies eventually are having access to education, knowledge, culture, but at the same time having access to a job, to the industry, and productivity. Without any connectivity, we cannot sell, we cannot trade, since we need to operate with debit and credit cards. And students could not study because the lockdown requires people to stay at home. So even though at the beginning of the 20th century, people in the health sector raised awareness in policymaking that water treatment networks and the sewage were sine qua non to prevent diseases, and based on that, providing water services or access was a human basic right and a public utility and a right to the citizenry. Right now, having access to water, electricity were essential basic rights. Right now, for the 21st century, the basic rights are having access to telecommunications and information technologies. For example, people couldn't graduate from school or universities if we do not have free access to having e learning during the lockdown. So we wonder, and before we wonder about having access to culture, do we wonder if these are businesses or industries? Yeah, they are. So we need to preserve the development of these businesses and industry, and we have public intervention in a democracy that is the state represented by the Senate out of the federal political system that we have. So we intervene to establish democratic rules of the game that can ensure equality to have access to these technologies because we may have different tiers in our citizenry. So we evidence that technology, industry, commerce, and trade require telecommunications or having access to communications and information technologies. So the president 2 months ago passed a decree that was eventually approved or adopted by Senate and became operational that declare mobile phone, telephony, internet, and payment over the internet as basic services. This means that from the legislative point of view, we will create the necessary conditions so the state may intervene in a regulation, not ruling out the competition among the private sector, but create the necessary conditions to have access to these technologies. I'm gonna give you a story of one of my students. I teach at two universities. One is the University of Buenos Aires, one of the oldest schools here, and the other one is the University of Jose C. Paz, the newest that is deployed in the suburbs of Buenos Aires. It's very poor. So we have freshmen there. Even though we struck agreements between companies and the university guaranteeing that we are going to have free connectivity in the free websites, a student said that she had issues connected to the university Wi-Fi. So she said, as it was too expensive, she went to a park to download some of the text because it was free Wi-Fi. But as it was raining, she couldn't go. So there was no other way to take the class that morning, and she asked if she could continue studying because she didn't have any money to connect. So the state intervention is to create the necessary conditions for those students to have the same equality of rights of connection compared to others, and to create the necessary conditions, having a minimum threshold for having access to education, because the pandemic is preventing something. However, once we finish with the pandemic, access to these technologies have first tier, second tier citizens. So 60% of the schools here in Argentina that do not have internet connection. Internet connectivity in the internet followed where the money is. In urban centers, large cities, you have better connectivity, and there's inequality with the most vulnerable sectors of society. In the city, you have, for example, 60%, and in the provinces, 43%, and in the north of Argentina, 40%. So 60% of that population that do not have access, doesn't have access to internet connectivity. There are small towns because of lack of connectivity. They do have the banking industry, but they do not have ATMs because you need or require connectivity for the ATM, for the banking industry, or for working in the banking industry. So we approach a double policy. On the one hand, declaring based on considering having access to telecommunications and communications a basic human right. And in this regard, we based in the resolution passed by the UN that speaks of human rights of technologies, also the Mexican Constitution of 2000 of 1913, and laws or regulation that you had in place, like for example the digital Argentine law, and we declare basic rights, especially to having access to these technologies and communications under these four pillars, where we have state intervention in trying to fix a fair, equitable, and reasonable price, introducing something new that is a social rate. So for those of you that they cannot pay for 100 megabytes, they will have some kind of a social equitable price based on their income with a reduced rate, both for internet, telephone services, and paid or satellite TV. This implies innovation in the new legislations or laws that we pass aimed at creating equal opportunities and leaving the private sector to keep offering competitively different prices with a different price scheme, and price raises should be justified on the income that is produced by people. So we guarantee universal access to these utilities, and we are also investing in Argentina with a universal fund of Argentina contributed to by all users through 1% of those internet services, and we have made investment in 60 billion pesos over the last 4 years to invest in public works. One that is physical in nature, the federal network of fiber optics, because we need to continue completing the 34,000 kilometers and up to $40,000 to condition the servers in our state cloud. And on the other hand, to build the three stationary satellite facilitated satellite internet to 1 million people in the most remote areas that are not highly populated, and those are 200,000 families, households. So you have the investment, most vulnerable sectors of society, 440,000 of them, and connecting the public sector like schools, hospitals, law enforcement, and those remote places like the Andes or the Delta, the Parana River areas between Uruguay, Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina. So we have public policy in place to create the necessary conditions and opportunities so that everybody could have access to some sort of these utilities, creating equal opportunities based on their economic conditions. Those that can pay could have faster access, or the state will intervene, creating the regulatory price so nobody's left behind. Now, the issue is how, to what extent, and when do we intervene with states with this public policy? In the case of Argentina, the decision made by Argentina is intervention. And we speak of democracy or democratic intervention adopted by regulations in Congress, fixing a set of minimum guidelines, declaring it as a basic service, but at the same time it allows the competition of these private sector stakeholders that can offer prices, because we have 1,200 companies providing service in this sector. And even though mobile telephony is in the hands of a few, three companies, and 80% is in the hands of 5 companies. The rest, 20% of the population, but probably is 50% of our territory, is in the hands of co-ops or small and medium-sized companies. So we're thinking of an adequate regulation for every single sector, protecting the investment by companies, their revenue, and at the same time having users that could be connected to a fair, equitable price that is affordable. So, Olga, if there are questions in the forum, I could gladly take them.
Gustavo, tenemos varias preguntas.
We do have many questions.
La primera
We're going to start
es
asking the
anónima,
first
pero
one.
pediría que pongan el nombre los que preguntan. Tenemos como
It's
300
anonymous.
personas
We
en
have
el
300
forum.
people.
¿Cómo
Please
podemos asegurar la
say your
eficiencia
names.
del servicio?
How can we guarantee investment and maintaining the infrastructure
Interviniendo de esta manera. O sea, ¿de
when
qué manera?
there's a state
Las
intervention?
solicitudes son todas parecidas.
Okay, more or less those are the same. Marisa Godoy says
Una alumna
that
reconoce
there was
que
a
a pesar
student
de
that
que
she knows that
usa la
despite
cuenta de la universidad,
the using
le consumieron sus
the
datos.
university account, all the data, all her data was used, and based on the decree as essential services, what are the changes that you will create with mobile antenna deployment?
Se apruebe el caso
And some municipalities that prevent these deployments. There was one case that reached the Supreme Court, and who's going to bear the cost and the investments of that social price or rate that you're suggesting or that you're
consultan también dónde quedó
passing in the legislation adopted
la
by
evaluación que se está
Senate,
tomando en cuenta.
some assessment that is being considered.
Son bastante parecidas
There are
todas.
many questions, and they're more alike. Let me take the first questions. The deployment of 4G antennas is a contractual obligation based on the bid between 2004 and 5 and 15. So the decree passed that is operational in Argentina does not interfere and does not prevent that obligation. That when they were successfully awarded the bid, they had to comply with this deployment. So they need to comply with their deployment, regardless whether or not there are changes in legislation in Argentina. As it was suspended by 3 years and it was resumed in 2019, we still have a few years to comply with this regulation. So they are required by law or by contract to finish their deployments. Some of them made progress and some of them are slowing down. So what is a requirement? Up to 500,000 people in a town, there should be one carrier, one company. There are many towns, like 7,000 people, that they don't even have 4G. So sometimes they don't have any connectivity. And ENACOM, that is regulatory framework, basically is making people comply with this regulation. Somebody asks who's going to bear the cost? Well, the state through subsidies. So co-ops, small and medium-sized companies, or other companies could provide this service, and it is paid by the state with this universal fund. So this is the investment by the state to reach those remote places where private companies or large companies are not present, with a small SMEs or strategic partnerships. Supposedly it's going to be cheaper because the infrastructure is borne by the state.
Las que te iba leyendo recién eran bastante
Yeah,
similares.
the other questions are similar.
Ah, sí.
There was another question that had to do with browsing. 2 out of the 3 mobile companies led the initiative of all public universities. The 3 released the prices for schools, and 1 company had platform issues, so it made available half of it. So during the pandemic, there should be an obligation on the part of companies or private companies to provide free navigation for educational websites that clearly do not affect their business, because indeed they are doing it because of the partnership agreements. Also, when the connectivity schemes are going to get to Patagonia, the west of Mendoza. Also, a question by Shasenia from El Salvador. She's asking what to consider in a digital inclusion law to include the human right to the internet. First, to declare it, saying that this is a human right. And also, I believe when you say that it's a public utility service, it means that you can intervene with public policy. This shouldn't be confused with the old monopolic services, at least in Argentina, that are typical of the 20th century services when there was a single provider and that was a state. In the United States, the electricity, the water services, or the landlines, telephony were monopolies provided by the state. Now, when in the 90s, all those services became privatized, it was still a monopoly, but provided by private companies, because we don't have two of each. We just have one single or sole network by locality, a sole provider. So this is in the hands of the private sector. So we declare it as public utility service, but with competition, because there's more than one provider by locality. So we want to increase competitiveness and competition. So this declaration will allow to intervene prices, so there are no price abuses, advocating those users or the users' right that were included in Section 42 in our Constitution. And so far, there was no way of preventing those prices, and that they could be affordable, equitable, and reasonable. So we have considered the cost of the investment and a reasonable income rate or profit. So we intervene so there are no monopolies in the excessive increase in prices to be paid for a certain service. However, they may compete among each other. So let me tell you that the declaration of these public services within a competitive sphere, declaring it that it's basic, will produce a equitable or a well-balanced perspective. At least that is our opinion. And two more questions. Do you agree that a human right, that internet is a human right, and if it's urgent, if we consider it as public utility, could be paid by or compensated by the private sector? It's going to take some time. It requires public and private investment to ensure connectivity so that we could produce or that these basic rights can become a reality. In 40 years, we intend to have 100% connectivity for schools. Right now, it's 40%. If we do not get to 100%, at least we're going to be closer because investment is going to be made. We do have the schemes in place to complete the public works for the public sector with schools, hospitals, and law enforcement. We already launched that, but we want to cover 100% connectivity, but at least we're going to be twice as much and probably get to 100%. Private investment shouldn't be changed because that investment is related to how economic growth is in the country rather than the prevailing regulation. When you analyze private investment in 2016-17 was high because in 15 we bid 4G, we open 4G free bids. Now, with the older rules of the games, that investment decreased because the purchasing power of money decreased. There was less investment because people could not pay for the services. At the same time, there was a reduction in public investment in public works. Apart from recovering or having an economic rebound in the pandemic, strong public investment is going to help with cheaper cost, more users navigating the internet, and that this may help recover private investment in turn.
Pregunta Nora Moreno. Le paso un saludo a Nora. Nora tiene todos sus
Nora
estudios en
Moreno
secundaria y siempre
is a
trae
school teacher, high school
chicos
teacher,
de último año
and
de
she
la
always
escuela
brings
técnica y nos
seniors
siguen a través del tiempo. Así que
and
un abrazo para ella y
they
para todos los
follow
muchachos que se llaman
our
Argentina
content.
Gobernanza Internet. Nora,
They
me
are
gustaría
called, they have a group that is
para
called
conocer
Youngsters in
si
Internet Governance.
si se han establecido controles para
Have
evitar
you
que
established
bajen la calidad de
checks
servicio
and
y
balances so that these
utilizar
companies
cuando
cannot
estamos haciendo
reduce the service given the regulation that has been in place? It's too early to say that. But as we have competition, the rationale is that none of these companies is going to reduce the quality of service because they're going to pick another provider. However, if they have a set price or a single price, they're not going to have one price. What is going to happen is that as of now, if they want to increase prices, they'll have to justify the earnings level and the cost of investment. But the quality of service, if one is offering 10, 15, and 20, is their problem. What we said is, as of now, those that want to have a price increase, they need to discuss it with the state. And also, we're going to have these social rates. And probably we need to double check this in practice because as they still compete among these stakeholders, nobody's going to reduce the quality of service because people can go to other services if they get
de contestarse
a
alguna
better
pregunta
service.
a estudiantes que estén
Do
interesados
you
en
have
participar en el
scholarships
ENACOM.
or
En los
fellowships
últimos
at
20 años el
ENACOM?
mundo
And is there a
del
country
Internet se
in
ha
the world
convertido
where
en
the
un
internet is considered a human right? Yes, there are many countries where they characterize this as a human right. Mexico in its constitution, the Court of France in 2009, and others have a strong state intervention, and this is what happens in Europe because some countries probably do not have specific regulation in place, but they do have regulation for competition. for dominant abuse of power. For example, our competition rules have always been flexible or lax, so to speak. If it had worked better, we wouldn't have taken these measures. Western Europe or the United States have very strict rules for the competition. So there are no other rules because you have a strong competition. Let me tell you that our competition in Argentina is loose, is lax, and in many places you don't have any competition. So this legislation aims at facilitating a more competitive place because we're going to be working on an asymmetrical regulation because it's not the same applying this for a small SME or for a large company. Their cost structures is totally different for these two companies because they have high levels of staffing where the other one does not. And in connection with education, not having access to knowledge or training, there are two things. ENACOM has the Superior Institute of Radio Broadcasting, ISER. It's a community college, it's free, it depends on us, where you can study everything that has to do with audiovisual career. For example, voice talents, study there, radio broadcasters, and through a promotion fund, we are approving also training courses. The idea is to recover the training. We're going to invest next month on this, and I believe that next year we can start with the fellowships or the scholarships. Unfortunately, we have the pandemic, so the idea is to train the co-ops and small SMEs to start this work based on what we are offering, that is connectivity in the most vulnerable sectors of society. So when the pandemic finishes,
Excelente.
this training is going to be in person. Thank you, Gustavo.
Pero ha sido muy claro. Acá te mandan saludos
We need
Andrea
to stick to
López.
the agenda. Adriana and Oscar say hi. They're
ENACOM recibe un
offering
saludo de todos los becarios y
this
becarias de toda América
with
Latina y
our
demás lugares
school.
del
Thank you
mundo.
very
Muchas
much.
gracias por su
All
generosidad.
students say hi. Thank you for your generosity, for your knowledge, for know-how, and to your best
Ah, las
disposal.
comunicaciones siempre
If
van a
you
estar
ever want
para
to communicate scholarships, we are at your disposal and we will certainly communicate this to our students. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We support your school because you do a good job. And greetings to Adrian that invited me to speak here
que tengas
in
una
this
linda
virtual
mañana
event. Thank you
todos.
very
Vamos a
much.
hacer una pausa.
Let's go for a coffee break right
Hola
now
Carlos,
and we will
8 de
resume
Argentina,
at
10 de Colombia, 10 de México,
12.
10 de Perú
10
y nos
Peruvian time, 10 Mexican time. Thank you.